do that. There we go. No, everyone's notified. Right. Okay, so as I said, Lara and I are the co-founders, along with Melissa Cumming, of PlaySense. We're the partners in crime who really started to think about early childhood education very differently. We believed that early childhood education was flawed in many respects. A couple of the things we really didn't like about it was the size of the classes, because we think that big classes don't fully meet children's needs at this age. We didn't like educations that were outcomes-based and outcomes-focused, and we're going to talk about that tonight. And we wanted little ones to be happy more than anything. And so with all of that in mind, and the fact that we really believed in empowering teachers as well, Lara and I founded PlaySense in 2016. So tonight we're going to be looking a little bit at how today's education is failing tomorrow's generation, and how to choose the right childcare and how it impacts your child's future. And then we're going to have a look at options for education. And then finally, how PlaySense is reimagining early childhood education through play. You are welcome to pop questions in the chat below. We have got Melissa on with us who will respond to them as well in the chat. And alternatively, we will respond to them later on this evening. So our world has changed dramatically. I mean, if anybody could have imagined 18 months ago where we find ourselves today, I'm quite certain nobody would have believed it. If somebody had said to you on the 1st of January last year that we would find ourselves doing more Zooms than live meetings, no one would have believed it. And so the way in which the world of work has changed in 18 months has given us some sort of context as to what has happened before. And if we look back, things have changed a lot more slowly, obviously. So in the Industrial Revolution, just before the Industrial Revolution, everybody was really working on farms. And in fact, your main reason for having children was actually so that you had a lot of hands, because the more children, the more hands. And so, of course, education wasn't prioritized because children didn't need to be educated. They were going to be working on your farms. So that's fabulous. That takes you back many, many years. Now, of course, what came next was the industrialized revolution, and the last 100 years of history has been very much focused on urbanization. And the reason for that is we had to go into town, into a place to work, and that was really what it was all about. And we needed to equip our children to be able to function in a workplace that happened in situations around boardroom tables and that involved a huge amount of content. And of course, between the dark ages and the last 100 years, education became very, very focused on being able to deliver content to children. Remember that the only time that you could get content prior to that period was if you went to church, because most people were illiterate. And so coming up with literacy and actually passing over information and content in a classroom, like where exactly America is compared to Africa as an example, was something that had to be taught in a classroom. And so education was a lot about filling minds, giving skills, and particularly skills that were going to be able to be used around the boardroom table or in factories or whatever it was. And that's really what many of us who were born in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, that's really what a lot of us were prepared for, because at that time, people didn't really imagine the world as we know it now. Now, of course, what we know now about the world is that our world is going to look very, very different. The boardroom table is increasingly becoming a thing of the past, overtaken by Zoom webinars, but also by boards and about spaces to brainstorm in and about areas where we can collaborate and be together as a business. And if you think about all the businesses of the future and all the businesses that are really cutting edge and looking and are forward thinking, a lot of what happens in those businesses happens in creative sessions like the one pictured here above. And so we are preparing our children for a very different world. And if you can think that we didn't know what was going to happen 18 months ago, much less do we know what's going to happen in 20 years' time, which is when your children are going to be entering the job market. But what we do know is that some things are going to change materially. And one of them is this little pink section at the bottom of this triangle, where in the past, having a working force and manual labor and having people do things was very important. That is going to increasingly be taken up by machines, by machine learning, by computers, because anything that is menial and that can be carried out without creativity will be automated. That is an absolute given. And we must say, thank goodness it's going to be, because most of us don't actually want to do the menial work. And human beings and our incredible brains were not necessarily built to do all the menial work. Our brains were built to be creative, to think up new ways of doing things. And that really is what the jobs of the future are going to be about. So things are going to be turned on their head, and the jobs of the future are going to encompass things where people are creative, where they can be thought leaders, and where they can own businesses and create jobs for themselves and for other people. And that is what we need to prepare your children for. So as we sit, and I know that you've probably got a toddler who you've just put to bed tonight, and we are thinking about just the day-to-day activities with toddlers, the reality is we need to be thinking 20 years out to the job space they're going to be working on, and how do we prepare them? How does education prepare them for the world that is to come? So the jobs of the future, we know, probably don't even exist today. Here's a simulation engineer and a custom implant organ designer. So these are the jobs that are going to come up in the future, and the jobs that we are going to be preparing your children for. So if we know that the jobs of the future are different, and we know that the skill set that will be needed for the jobs of the future is therefore different, the question becomes, how on earth are we trying to think about keeping education the same? The reality about education is that it was built for a different time. It was built with different demands. We needed to get content into brains. We needed to teach skills that could be used in spaces like in agriculture and in mechanics and all of that type of thing. We needed skills and we needed content. And we had a different agenda. And what happened was, because we were trying to educate people en masse and teach everybody the same thing, because that was our big workforce, we ended up putting all children into spaces which needed infrastructure. And that really was the foundation of schools. Get as many people into as small a room as possible with one adult, so we can pass as much information as possible into as many brains at the same time. What ended up happening is that we built schools, and schools over time have become more and more expensive in terms of their infrastructure. So we now have large school buildings with expensive infrastructure. What happens is that when you're paying your school fees into a school that has a large infrastructure, of course, what ends up happening is that those fees have to go into the infrastructure as opposed to the most important person in the room, other than your child. And that, of course, is their teacher. And so teachers in the classical model, we believe, are underpaid and undervalued. They're doing the most important job in the world. Very few people dispute that. And yet they are amongst the poorest paid in our communities and in job spaces. The other problem is that education, which was put into large classrooms for older children, then just got replicated down. So as younger and younger children entered into the education system, so we just replicated exactly the same. Big classrooms, 30 children in a space, and that was how we did it. And so it was this kind of one-size-fits-all approach to education. So one size fits all ages, as well as one size fits all personalities. And of course, now, as we look back post-COVID, we realize it's also quite inefficient. And we can see that there can be a better way of doing things than the old-fashioned education system. So the message now is that schools and traditional schools are a product of history. And it's time for schools to be reinvented. And it's time for schools to deliver content and relationships that are going to change your child's trajectory and prepare them for a future world. So we know that the trends have been coming over the last year. Lara and I actually started to speak about micro schools or small schools of just 6 children in a home long before the pandemic hit. And yet last year, through isolation, what actually did happen is that all these pandemic pods or these micro schools started to develop across the world. And so a trend that we had seen coming and had started well before was then, of course, fast-tracked through the chaos that is COVID. So we have small schools, and we believe that that is the way of the future, particularly for young children. Right, so how do we create education that is purpose-built, that can create future players? And Lara and I are going to go through a couple of the foundations that we know need to be part of education for little ones. So when Lara and I sat down, and this was going back to 2016, we did an away game, and we sat together and we started to talk about what were the real critical skills that we want to impart to your children. Was it reading? Did they need to be able to read by the time they left us? Or was it be able to hold a pencil correctly? What was it that we knew that would become our mandate? And there were 5 things which I'm going to talk through this evening with Lara that we identified as the core capacities that were going to be needed for future players. And of course, what really struck us as completely amazing was that it was just a year later that Project Oxygen came. I was reading about it on the internet. It was actually on the 4th of January. I will never forget it. And started to realize that Project Oxygen, which was a piece of research that Google did to find the absolute best recruits for their business, when they were looking for the soft skills that were going to be the best soft skills on which to base their recruitment, they were the exact things that Lara and I had identified when we did our away game. And those are the things I'm going to talk about tonight. And I'm going to share with you a little about the science about these core capacities that your child needs. And then I'm going to ask Lara what education looks like if it's going to bring about that mandate or going to achieve that goal. So our very first goal of early childhood education is something called self-regulation. Now, self-regulation is a human ability to be able to control your deepest impulses, to be able to control your human or bodily environment in the context of your social environment. And it's really an amazing capacity that happens in various different brain levels. In the most foundational brain level, it involves physiological homeostasis. So that's the ability to maintain your body temperature or your heart rate. And so when you get a fright and your heart starts to really race or your hands go clammy, you're actually experiencing a physiological shift. And that's your body responding to something in the environment in order to prepare you. So maybe you get a fright and your body thinks, I've got to be able to run really fast to be able to get away from this. And so your heart starts to beat fast so that it can get blood to your organs. And that's the way in which your body, as an example, actually prepares you through physiological self-regulation. Going up a little bit in a baby, your newborn baby would have been experiencing arousal modulation, the ability to control their self in the face of lots of stimulation in their world. So when your newborn was faced with lots of stimulation, they might end up crying. And about 4 months old babies have started to be able to self-regulate that so they can actually engage with their world without becoming overwhelmed. So those two things happen at a really basic level, but it's our next two things that happen in the toddler years. And these toddler years are absolutely formative in the development of self-regulation. And if we don't get it right at that time, we land up with little ones who don't self-regulate very well. And the pinnacle of self-regulation, as you can see up here, is cognitive regulation, which is the ability to control your attention span and your thought processes and your thoughts. And that ability is based on the two other abilities that do develop in the toddler years, and that is emotional regulation and behavioral regulation. So emotional regulation is the ability to control your emotions when something really upsets you. So for an example, if you took a cell phone away from a 6-month-old, they might start to absolutely scream and cry. Or if you say no to your toddler when you're in the sweetie aisle in the shops and they throw themselves on the floor and have a temper tantrum, that's emotional dysregulation. And the ability to control our very big emotions is something that happens in the toddler years. And when it's developed, little ones have the ability to have frustration tolerance. So they can tolerate when they're frustrated that you're not giving in to them. They can wait for things. And they start to be able to develop what we call behavioral regulation, which is the ability to not act on an instant impulse. So a 2-year-old who instantly wants to push their friend because their friend came and took their toy away, learns to actually control that and not just push their friend. Now, for those of you with 12 to 18 months old, I'm sure you can hardly imagine that your child will ever have behavioral and emotional regulation, but it does come. And the way that it develops is what is so magical. So the first piece of self-regulation develops in the context of a very close, caring and loving and co-regulated parental relationship. So mom or dad or granny or maybe a nanny at home, really focusing in on your child's emotions, telling them that they're important, identifying their emotions early on, and forming a solid relationship of attachment. And that's the foundation of self-regulation on an emotional and behavioral level. But the next step that happens in the toddler years happens when your child is taken from your care into the care of someone else. And so you can start to see how critically important this very first relationship outside the home is, this teacher relationship with your child. And so at this point, I'm going to pause before we get on to the other ones. And I'm going to ask Lara to just speak a little bit about how Play Sense or any other education system should be thinking about developing self-regulation in toddlers.
Thanks, Meg. So the first thing one needs to consider is the size of the group. So having a small group means, well, firstly, little ones obviously need this individual attention. As you said, they're moving from that one-to-one relationship into a bigger group. So they need someone who can give them individual attention and not just have a teacher who's doing chaos control with large groups. The teacher needs to be able to know the child, to know their sensory personality, how they like to engage, how best they pay attention. We actually train our teachers in being co-regulators. So that means the teacher acts as this bridge between dependence to self-regulation in very small steps. For example, they mirror their emotions. They understand the intent of their behavior. They offer choice and distraction. And we find they're far less discipline issues in a small group with a nurturing teacher, and a child whose emotional needs are are seen, and then they are assisted with these big emotions that our toddlers have. In terms of frustrations, I think as a society, as parents, we want to make things easy for our little ones. We want to avoid discomfort, but we have to help a child through the frustrations of having to learn to share, of not always getting your own way. And this happens in a group. That's how we develop emotional and behavioral regulation. How we develop resilience is by sailing the storm with a co-regulator. So Meg, it's really those things: a small group, co-regulation, and helping little ones ride their frustrations.
Yeah, and to add to what Laura said, very often when we're interviewing our teachers and we tell them that they're going to be managing 6 children in a group, they can't imagine what a wonderful dream world this can be, because a lot of what happens with teachers who've got more than 6 toddlers in a classroom is that it is just damage control. And so you're moving from one snotty nose to one crying child to one temper tantrum, and you never, ever, ever get to just focus in on that individual child. Another very important piece of our puzzle that Laura and I have developed into the curriculum is our very first love letter. So when you join PlaySense, you will get a love letter, and you'll get one every term. And your very first love letter is on your baby's sensory personality. And when our teachers are trained, they are trained to look at the baby's or the toddler's sensory personality. And when they can identify the reason behind behavior based on the way that the child approaches sensory information, it explains behavior in a way that really creates enlightenment and connection. And I think it's that insight and that connection that is really, really important from a teacher. So it's the small group, that co-regulator with insight. And then obviously the frustration part is that your little one, when they're at home and you're just the only one catering to them, they don't necessarily come up with the frustrations or against the frustrations that they're going to in a classroom situation. So absolutely loved what you said, Lara, and it is all about the small group, the co-regulator, and the frustrations. So before I go on to the next point, we've got a great question here from Charisma. Jerisa, sorry, I know I'm not saying your name correctly. She said, is a 2-year-old capable of achieving self-regulation? So the answer to that question is yes, but it is developmental. So as an example, if we had a 2-month-old who wasn't walking, would anybody be concerned about it? No, because a 2-month-old is absolutely not supposed to be walking. They're supposed to be not even rolling yet. But if you had a 2-year-old who wasn't walking, you would be concerned. And that's because they're developmental milestones, they're developmental kind of parameters in which we expect for things to develop. And the developmental parameter for emotional regulation is from 9 months until about 3 years old. And the parameters for behavioral regulation is from about 2 years old till about 6 or 7 years old. So they've got quite wide parameters, but they need to be developed during that period, and they need to have the opportunity to be developed during that period. So I hope that answers your question. All right, going on to our next mandate. So this is the next thing that we talk about when we talk about with our teachers about the mandate, about what they need to make sure is delivered in their program and that your child exits with. The next thing is collaboration. And we know that the research across the world, including Project Oxygen, but a whole lot more research, tells us that the ability to collaborate and work in teams and come together with a solution in a group is critically important for future thinkers. So how does this develop? Well, first of all, the first thing that develops very early on is attachment. So I see that we've got the word social there written there, but it had actually said attachment. And attachment is what happens between a parent and their child in the very early days. So you attached with your little one, you formed a relationship, you told your little one that they were very important, and you gave them a sense of self. So that is in the first 2 years of life. In the second 2 years of life, Erickson will tell us that the next phase is the ability to develop either autonomy versus doubt. And that's what little ones need to do. They develop autonomy, which is feeling strong and feeling like that they are important. Or if they are handled in a very punitive manner, they can develop doubt. So that's the developmental crisis of the 2-year-old. Coming out of that, once they've developed autonomy and through the process of socialization and attachment, they start to think beyond themselves. They start to think of the other, and that the other has a personality, and that the other has intent and wills and needs, and that the other person is actually affected by their behavior. So when they throw a temper tantrum or when they hit the other person has an emotional response. And so that ability to think outside of yourself about another person's emotions is one of the next steps of socialization. And then finally, of course, in this whole puzzle is language, the ability to actually share a thought that is in my mind with your mind is the magic of language. And Vygotsky, which is one of the researchers that we based our program on, speaks a lot about language. He calls it the ultimate tool of the mind, or the greatest tool of the mind. And so language becomes the gateway in which we can start to help our little ones to collaborate. So Lara, at that point, will you share a little bit about how play sense meets a child's needs for collaboration and develops collaboration soft skills?
Sure, Meg. Just one thing on that is how with our school system, another way it's flawed is that we actually all about competition, aren't we? And actually the future skill is really about collaboration. So how do we get that at play sense? Well, the first thing is through this group, the social connection. We move from this healthy attachment to a caregiver in our lives. In fact, all healthy socialization with others is built upon that primary relationship. And so they're moving from that primary caregiver to the teacher, and then also other little friends. They learn to really belong in a group, and that feeling of belonging is absolutely essential to this development of autonomy. Then social mediation. The teacher can support the children to learn to socialize. It's not actually natural. You've already said we actually have to learn to share, to take turns, to not pull our friends' hair when we're frustrated. We also have a very language-enriched curriculum, and we focus on emotions, all the language around emotions, to help develop these social skills. Just as you said, we actually need this tool to socialize. So children, before this stage of having language, they engage in parallel play, where they enjoy being next to each other. But cooperative play only comes when their language comes, which is this big spurt between 2 and 3. Then another way we achieve this is through imaginary play. Now, when children are engaged in imaginary play, they take on roles, they make a plan, they use props, they imagine a scenario with a beginning, a middle, and an end. They laugh together, they use theme-rich language. And what also happens in a group is you have little friends who are at different developmental places, potentially a little bit older, or maybe they have a sibling, so their language may be more advanced, or their imaginary play may be more advanced. And so you actually have these little playmates who also scaffold this collaboration. And then a group identity. So the best way to create this interaction is in a small group of children and one co-playing, co-regulating teacher. And Meg, the research actually shows that pro-social skills, which are our voluntary behaviors, which are intended to benefit another, just what you've said about that little brain learning to think beyond myself. The research has shown that these factors have an impact on cognitive development and are just as important in learning to read as the ability to learn sounds and letters. And in fact, pro-social skills predict for academic achievement despite IQ and social economic status. So really focusing on the collaboration is essential.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so we're going to move on to the next one. So when Lara and I sat together on that weekend away and we said, okay, so what are the things that we really want to mandate our teachers to develop in children? We had self-regulation and we had collaboration, and then we had a whole lot of stuff that we didn't know where to put it. It was things like grit and determination, creativity, imagination, resourcefulness, engagement and focus in tasks, volition, or the will to follow through on something and to do something, and motivation to learn, a sense of self-efficacy and drive, a love for learning, and an inspired human being. And we looked at this list and we said, my goodness, these don't fit into anything else. They all fit together in a bucket of something around the magic behind learning. And so we called it the super senses. And these super senses are the pieces of human core capacities that really do predict for children who are going to be successful long term. And I think for me and for Lara as well, as mothers of 3 kids each, having a child who loves learning, who has curiosity, who wants to know more, who needs the answer to why all the time, is a real gift. And I think that needs to be encouraged in any education program as well. So Lara, how does Play Sense do that?
Sure. So one of the first things we do is make sure your little one is happy. So We can't always, I suppose, promise we're magicians, but what actually happens to the brain is that it lights up for learning when a child is not in an anxious state. And the best thing ever for a parent is to leave and fetch a happy child. Most of our little ones feel like they're on an extended play date, and this really helps to ease separation. Then inspiration, being inspired. They should love learning, as you said, and we do this through rich themes, sensory play, and free play, which all enables intrinsic motivation, control, and attention, so the child stays engaged and really enjoys that experience and knows that school, in inverted commas, is a great place to be. And then imaginary play. There's no right or wrong. And we've found that this really becomes the foundation for literacy, for loving reading, for loving words, for loving stories. And then enriched. Our small group means that the teacher puts a lot of effort into their themes, their books, and even can involve parents. So we've had parents dress up as scuba divers, as a vet. They've gone out to groups to visit the zoo or the aquarium in relation to these themes to create this really enriched learning environment. And our art and sensory play is very diverse, very stimulating, and process-driven, because to develop these super senses, we need to, like you've said, drive curiosity and help children to understand that there's no wrong answer when you're this little.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think for me, the main reason behind starting play since right in the early days, when my son, I drop him every day off at school, and he would cry when I dropped him, and he'd cry when I fetched. He was crying when I fetched him. And the teacher kept saying to me, leave him for longer, leave him more days, he'll get used to it. And deep inside, I knew it wasn't true, and ended up starting play since for all three of my kids. And when my middle child turned 18, she wrote me a letter thanking me for the things that I'd done in her life. And she said one of the best things that happened in her life was what she called Taflin School, which was her teacher. And so I do think that having happy children in a home environment is the only way to really ignite those super senses. And then, Lara, our fourth mandate that we talk about is executive function. And most of you will know what executive function is. It's the ability to really plan through things. It has also been called the CEO of the brain. So I am the CEO of PlaySense, and I can tell you that when I look at the way that what this picture of executive function looks like, I can tell you it's just like being a CEO. So CEO sets goals. They decide the direction that we need to go in. They plan a method, and they start to have a look at the resources that are around them. So what can I use in order for this to happen? They make decisions and prioritize what has to happen, and then use judgment to work out if this is actually working out okay, and then problem solve and think flexibly. And then sometimes they have to change direction completely and reflect on themselves and self-check, and then set goals again. And so this whole cycle happens if you're a CEO of a company or an entrepreneur. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And this is exactly what happens in the brain. It's one of the human abilities, in the cognitive abilities, that allows us to really plan what we're going to do and to execute on that plan, but to also have the mental flexibility to be able to change direction. And that's executive function. And children need to have that level of judgment in order to really succeed in the future of the world. And so how large do we facilitate that?
So Meg, we really use imaginary play as it's part of our day every single day. And this really enables the teacher to guide the children through an imaginary scenario. So essentially, being a CEO, your scenario there is the business, right? But here they'll draw on books that they read. They'll use props that they make in art, and they'll act out roles as a group. So if you look at this photo here, these little boys are playing, they're putting out the fire, and you can see how much effort the teacher's gone to with the building. But they're using the things they have around them. They're getting dressed up. They've assigned their roles. They're acting as a group. This involves judgment. It involves memory, remembering the story from this morning or the song that we sang, planning, who's going to be what, reflection, and then retrying. So they'll be asking themselves things like, what do we need? Who do we need? How do we call them? What do they use? And this really links to self-regulation. When children also willingly place constraints on their own actions. So for example, lying still for a doctor to examine you. You can't pretend with another person unless both of you agree to what you're pretending. So the players must conform to a set of rules And practice conforming to such rules helps children to develop better self-control over time. And that's also part of executive function. So, a very busy child suddenly looks actually quite calm, and they're standing at attention because they're the castle, the guard at the castle who's, protecting the princess from the dragon that's coming. So it's amazing to see this age and how their brains are primed for imaginary play. And the other thing about executive function, Meg, I'm sure you'll know when your plan goes a bit off piece, you might have to apologize to someone. And so executive function is also a lot about empathy. And that just brings us back to those pro-social skills, which are so critical.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are wondering, the pictures that you've seen in this slide presentation are all from PlaySense schools. And this particular one really just shows you two aspects of PlaySense that I think you would like to know about. The first one is that our teachers are absolutely unbelievable at making props. And here's an example of a prop that is a fire space. And every day on our little resource group, we see the most amazing things being configured and built for your children. And that's really what we do, is we build sets in order to create a play space that entices your children to have imaginary play. The piece of ladder over here that you can see is part of the jungle gym, which all of our teachers have to purchase our kits. And that's part of their franchise. And part of their kit is a jungle gym. And this jungle gym is incredible because it breaks down into all sorts of things. Sometimes it's an airplane. Sometimes in this case, it is a fireman's ladder. It has been a Boeing 747. It has been a train. What else has it been? It's been a cow. It's made into all sorts of things. A Land Rover.
Doctor's room.
A doctor's room. So whatever the theme is of the week, your child will then be making things. They make their own props. And then those props become part of what they use for their imaginary play sessions. So Lara, that kind of brings me onto a great question that somebody has popped up here. She asked, how does PlaySense compare with Montessori?
Sure, what a question. So, when I set about writing the program, I looked a lot around if we were trying to develop self-regulation, executive function, and creativity, then what sort of pedagogy or educational approach really develops those things? And I looked into Waldorf, Montessori, Reggio, all the different approaches, and each has its strengths. In pure Montessori, so I'm just going to talk about pure Montessori because there's a lot of variation, but pure Montessori doesn't actually consider fantasy play important or the imagination. It's very much about concrete thinking, about learning one-to-one correspondence with what's known as sensorial activities, activities of daily living. There's not a lot of group work. So the focus is very much on how do we develop attention in children. And it's the child chooses what they want to do every day. They engage in that. A lot of the puzzles and things are self-correcting. So that does mean that it helps a child to focus. What's interesting, Meg, is I think at this age, because there's such a need for language, a need for socialization, Montessori to me does not really emphasize that. So the research shows they have great attention, but also children will just keep doing the things that they're interested in, where if you are still encouraging a child to think, to be intrinsically motivated, to have choice, our children have choice within an activity, but they learn about the group. They use rich language. They use stories and fantasy. So another example that I find quite pertinent is just that we learn within a context. And so, a classic Montessori experience for a child might be that there's a grater and a soap, and they can, grate the soap, smell the soap, feel the soap, great fine motor activity, sensory activity. But to me, it's quite devoid of context, whereas in our groups, they might grate something like cheese and put it on a sandwich at snack time and then share it with their friends. So we want to put everything into a learning context for our little ones around socialization and rich language development. So I hope that's very brief. There's obviously
and I think
every approach.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that always strikes me, because we do train our teachers in the differences between the different pedagogies, and one of the things that strikes me is that the Montessori pedagogy is very reliant on the environment. That's why the classrooms are so beautiful, and they really are. When you see a Montessori classroom, they look amazing, and the room is set up in order to entice children into engaging with activities. We believe that the best way to entice a human being out of their comfort zone is through relationship. So we talk about what's called the zone of proximal development, which means that if your child has developed a certain skill or certain course set or kind of level, something just outside of that is really tough for them. And with a human relationship, we can teach them how to get there. And we actually do that very naturally as parents all the time, because that's our role. And that's the role that our teachers play. They help to scaffold our children into things that are tricky for them, but they master and they accomplish, and it gives them a sense of self-esteem and accomplishment. And that can only happen in the context of a relationship. It can't happen when you're leaving children to their own devices to kind of accelerate their own education. So there are quite a few differences, I think, between play sense and Montessori in many respects. So going on now into the questions that you should be asking. So as you start to tour schools, for those of you who are looking for schools for your little ones, we're going to give you 4 questions that we think you should be asking every time you walk into a classroom or every time you look at your child in their education setting. And if you're in play sense, these are the questions that you should be asking about our teachers. The first thing is my child happy every day? And I think that being happy is critically important. Just a little bit about neuroscience. This red part of the brain down here is our brainstem, and it's a very primal part of our brain. It's otherwise called the reptilian brain. It's very basic. Even reptiles have this part of their brain, and it is the part that reacts instantly on instinct. So a lizard has a great reptilian brain. That's why it's called a reptilian brain. And so if they see a flash of a movement, they can instantly run in the opposite direction because their reflexes are just so fast. And so that reflexive response often is in response to fear, in response to pain, in response to being threatened. A little bit higher up, the next part of our brain, which covers that limbic, brain stem, is called our limbic system, and it's where our emotional seat sits. So human beings have high emotions, and so our emotional seat is the limbic brain. And a little bit higher than that is our neocortex, or our new brain. And that is the part where the CEO sits, where the executive function sits. And when you are in a happy space, this is the area of the brain that fires. And that's why learning happens when children are happy. And so when children are unhappy, when children are anxious, they are in either their limbic brain or potentially even in their reptilian brain. And no learning can take place in those brains. Children can only be patterned for avoidant behavior when they are in those type of headspaces. And so one of the most critical things that I ask as a parent of 3 children is my child happy every day? Do they want to go to school? Do they have relationships in that school that make them feel secure and content? They must not be terrified of their teacher. They must not be fearful of another child in the environment. They must feel like they're in a safe space all the time, because when they're in a safe space, it means that they'll be out of their red brain and up into their green brain. And that's how children learn. So that's the first question that you need to ask yourself when you're looking for a school. What's the second question? La.
Is it play-based? So very, very importantly, is there sensory play? Is there free play? Is there imaginary play? Imaginary play is fast disappearing from our playgroups in favor of school readiness activities. And this comes down to the teacher. Is she able to engage with the children? Is she able to come alongside and scaffold them, as Meg was talking about, that we learn in relationship with others? Does she have the time to play with children? Or is she engaging with so much pre-academic work type activities and assessments that she doesn't actually ever get on the ground and enjoy your little one? Does she know your child? So that Meg brought up earlier about our love letters and the sensory profile, knowing how they engage, what are their favorite play activities. Having time to just set up these amazing, you can see there again, there's an aeroplane and a tent, they're going camping. So does she have the time to really make her curriculum play-based?
Absolutely. And I think it's such a buzzword. Everybody's curriculum everywhere in the world is now saying it's play-based. But the reality is it's got to have imagination. It's got to have props. It's got to have storylines. It's got to have sensorial play, as you said, Lars. So that's very, very important. Is education play-based? If you have a 2-year-old and you're listening to me, and there's a tabletop activity set up when you drop your child off at school in the morning, that's not play, okay? So that needs to be on the floor. It needs to be mucking in. If they come home absolutely perfectly clean every day, that's also a problem. Children need to be playing, they need to be getting dirty, they need to be getting down, they need to be imagining a new world. So really make sure that it is play-based. The third thing that I would like to encourage you to think about is how big the group is. And we've spoken about this. Our teachers do not like teaching big groups because it is damage control. Children do not do well in big groups because they can't learn self-regulation through co-regulation. A group is important. So for those of you who are sitting on the fence about whether or not to send your child to school, a play group, or whether to keep them at home with a nanny, nothing wrong with a nanny. In fact, Lara and I are both very big advocates of nanny care. But there does come a point in your child's formative years, so under the age of 4, where they need to be in a social milieu. And the reason they need a social milieu is they need to be challenged by other people, but they need to do it in an environment that has adequate ratio of teacher to child. So small groups are important. Groups are important, but small groups are important. So the minute you've got 2 carers to 12 children, you've kind of blown it out. You really need 6 children to 1 carer until your child is about 4 years old. And then outcomes-based learning, La.
Yeah, so Meg, unfortunately, we live in this age of schoolification, where we erroneously believe that because they need to read and write and do maths at the age of 6 or 7, that we should bring that earlier and earlier into these early years. Research and the best education systems in the world suggest the opposite, that we need to let them play, that we must cherish their childhood, that we must trust that play is how they learn, and that they need an in-tune caregiver. When we assess children, make them sit at tables, when all the art looks the same, when they're filling in worksheets, it results in learning that is shallow, actually potentially harmful, and misses out on all these foundational skills that they really can't catch up later. It also results in anxiety when we treat children as empty heads that need to be filled with academic knowledge and skills. They don't develop the pro-social skills that we discussed earlier. So really look at how they're supporting each child's individual learning journey, their own passions, their own sensory profile, and not cookie cutter, kind of the same artwork.
For all children, absolutely. Yeah. Right, so we're coming to the end of our chat with you tonight. I'm going to answer just a couple more questions quickly. So our ideal group size is, of course, under 6 children for 2 to 3-year-olds. And Joan asks, what about the ideal group size for 3 to 5-year-olds? It can get a little bit bigger, Joan. You can go up to 8 little ones. PlaySense does go to 5 years old. So Lara has just been developing our 4 to 5 curriculum, which is our pre-school curriculum, and we're calling it learning readiness, not school readiness. And we've developed this incredible program, so your children can stay all the way from 2 until 5 years old. And if they do that, they'll be in a group of no more than 6 all the way through to 5 years old. But if you're going to a regular school, often it will become a slightly bigger group at that age, Joan. And then a great question from Julie. She says, do our teachers receive ongoing training and how often? So Lara, will you tell us a little bit about the care that we take of our teachers?
Yes, so making our teachers happy is so critical, helping them grow on their own learning journey, because we know that filters down to little ones. So our teachers have regular support meetings with their pod manager once a month, and they also have training with me every single month. So it's very important for us. They have initial training, 30 hours of training with Meg and myself, online plus Q&A sessions, and then ongoing training. We also manage standards through various means, such as parent surveys, an incentive program, and the love letters, the newsletters they need to send out every week. So we have a really good sense of what's happening in the groups as well.
Yeah, and we even have an occupational therapist called Lara Court, and she goes in. If our teachers are having a really tricky time with one little one in their group, or the little one's having a tricky time at home, she'll call in our occupational therapist, and she'll actually consult, not as an OT, but just as an educator, to just assist our teachers with our little ones. So we have a really robust system for containing our teachers, who then in turn can actually really just focus on teaching your little ones. So we're coming to the end now, and I'm going to ask Jade to pop up some information. Okay, sorry, I've just got one more question coming through, and then I'm going to tell you which groups to go to. Danielle asked, where do we find our teachers and how do we vet them? So that responsibility falls largely to Mandy and to Melissa. And our teachers, we're looking for teachers all the time. We are always interested in having teachers join us, but we go through a very, very careful process of selection with our teachers. They need to have some sort of background in early childhood education themselves. So whether they're a teacher or an au pair, an occupational therapist, and they also have to have enough hours with children as well. So we're very careful. They go through criminal checks, and then they have to actually invest in the business. So our teachers have to be business people as well. So if they really are these little gems, when we find them, we hold on to them very hard because they are absolutely fabulous. And what we may not have said tonight is that they are the magic. They really are. They are what makes your children's days absolutely amazing. We're just there to support them. So now, as we finish off, I just want to say that we really do welcome you and your little ones to our Play Sense groups. We are really, really excited to have them. They can join this year. We do have spaces in some of our groups. If your little ones are too young to join this year, because they can only join from 22 months, then they can join for next year. And these beautiful, magical women, who you can see up on your screen right now, are our pod managers. So we've got Kath, who's the Free State and Gauteng pod manager. Lara, who you've been listening to, obviously, she oversees the 4 to 5 curriculum. Kim is in KwaZulu-Natal, the Eastern Cape, and Mpumalanga. And Nicola is in the Western Cape. And then we've got Mandy, if you want to become a Play Sense teacher. Now, if you have a look below in your chat, you will see that there is a Zoom link for each of these women. So you can see Lara's is there first on 4 to 5. So if you're interested in 4 to 5, you're going to click on that link, leave this room, and switch across to Lara. We've then got Kath, who's Orange Free State and Gauteng. We've then got Kim, who is obviously in KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga. Nicola, who's Western Cape, and then Mandy as well, who is here to chat about with you about becoming a teacher. So you have also had those links emailed to you. So we are going to depart from this room and go into the other rooms if you would like to. If you just want to be contacted, then please do be in touch with us. And if you've got other questions not relating to going into one of these, then Melissa and myself are going to stay here in this room and we'll be continuing the conversation. So do stay with us, and you're welcome to, I'll be continuing to answer the questions, and so will Melissa from here. So thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to finish off with the sharing now. And from here, you can go off into your other groups. So thank you for joining us. Good night. Right, hi Melissa. Let's see if anybody is here who still has questions. Malika, so I'm going to answer the questions as they come up. Anybody who is still here, you're welcome to just ask the questions. Otherwise, move across to your other links. So Malika asks, are some activities food-based? We have strict dietary requirements, halal. Are we able to accommodate for that? Absolutely, we do. So do you want to talk that one through, Melissa?
Yeah, absolutely. So pre-COVID, we actually used to have social snack sharing in each of the groups. And this would mean that every single week, one of the parents would take the responsibility for supplying the food for the whole group for that week. And at the start of a group, you will sit down with your other 5 parents in the group and the teacher, and you will all discuss any strict dietary requirements that are required. So anything that is cultural, anything that is potentially an allergy-based issue, and you will all know exactly what the little ones are going to be eating. And then the parent would take on the responsibility every single week, and the teacher would be very involved in making sure all the parents know what's coming up in the roster, and just reminding parents about what is and isn't acceptable. Obviously, with COVID, we've been a bit stricter because of social snack sharing not being very COVID friendly, and having lots of little hands all touching the same food, and also for the teachers' preparation. So what we have done in last year when COVID struck is that each child would take in their own individual snack, individually wrapped, and so that would mean you would be able to take in your own food. Some teachers did go back into social snack sharing where they were preparing the food very strictly, and instead of having it on a sharing plate, they would each child would get the social snack, the same food, but they would just make sure that was prepared independently. So it really is, the great thing about Play Sense is that every group is individual. Every teacher parent year is different year on year. So you'll find that as a group, you become like a little family in a way. And generally what you'll find is that you will set the tone for the year with your teacher and the rest of your parents in your group. And it's very individualized in that way. So we can absolutely accommodate you. And then in terms of the potty training, that's actually part of our curriculum. So it's absolutely fine if your little one isn't potty trained yet. Our teachers are trained in how to get your little ones potty trained, and Meg also does assist with potty training webinars for our parents, because we know that this is the age where it's needed most. So you don't have to worry about that at all. Our teachers will help with changing nappies, and then also get your little one into potty training along with their little friends. So as I said, we work it into the curriculum. There is potty time when each of the little ones will line up on their cushions and either have their nappy changed or try the potty or the toilet. And often we find at this age, obviously, it's great for little ones to learn from their friends and see what their little friends are doing. And it often encourages and assists with potty training. And then Meg will obviously give you the support as a parent to carry on and assist with your potty training at home.
Absolutely. So are there any other questions? That was a great question from Malika. So are there any other questions that have come through? I'm just having a look. Okay, here we go. So here's a question from Louise. How does Play Sense fit into the traditional schools that our children are most likely to move to when they're 6? So it completely dovetails brilliantly with it for 2 reasons. There are 2 things that you want for your child by the time they're going into school when they're 6. Number one, you want them to be confident and wanting to learn, which are those super senses. And the other thing is that you want them to have certain foundations that are in place for long-term learning. And we don't call it school readiness, we call it learning readiness. It's way bigger than just going to school. It's about being ready to learn, about being ready to learn maths and writing and reading and so on. Everything in our curriculum gears your child towards that. And particularly now that Lara's developed the 4-to-5 curriculum, and the 4-to-5 curriculum is entirely play-based, but it teaches your little ones letters and sounds and pre-reading skills and pre-mathematical skills, comprehension, all sorts of really incredible skills that are needed for long-term learning. And so we believe, and we've actually got UCTs, we've paired with UCT to do some research for us on this, but we believe that children coming out of Play Sense will have much higher pro-social skills, which has been shown to be a big predictor for success long-term. But in addition to that, our kids will be learning ready. So we are aware of where your child's going. We want them to be confident and we want them to be completely ready for learning long term. So it is definitely something that's key in our mind. So that one I answered. Was there another question there?
There is one from Sue about children at the age of 2 socializing.
Okay, yes. Sorry, at the age of 2, do you see children socializing? My 2-year-old still plays alongside each other. Yes, so parallel play can continue all the way through until they're 2 years old. But as soon as they're in social situations, you'll start to see them actually doing collaborative play, which is not necessarily playing with the same intent, but playing with the same toy. So for instance, 2 children playing together with water as an example. And then later on, there'll be the sharing and the taking. And as that starts to happen, they'll start to do more collaborative play, which does come later on. And that's the precursor to social play. I think that has answered all of our questions that are up. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I see Larita says she's struggling to get into the Eastern Cape room with Kim, and she wants to know whether or not there are more groups planned in PE. Yes, so Larita, we are. I see that Jade is working with Kim to try and get her Zoom link working. But just in the interim, we are trying to get groups up and running for 2022. We are in the process of interviewing potential franchisees that are interested in starting Play Sense in Port Elizabeth. We don't have any groups running there at the moment, but absolutely that is the intention. So the more parents that we've got interested in PE, the better, because obviously this assists us in growing the number of groups that we can actually open. So if you are intent on starting a Play Sense group in PE, we would love to hear from you, and especially if you'd like to be a host home. So I'm not sure if this is something that you would consider, but obviously one of the key ingredients to creating a Play Sense group, not only is it the teacher, but it's also the venue as well as the other parents. And so those are the 3 key ingredients to starting a Play Sense group. So where we don't actually have a group currently running, we will form a new group. And if we've got a host home and enough interested parents, we can then assist in getting a teacher and placing her in that host home. So we would love to hear from you if you are interested in starting a PE group. So please do get in touch with us. If you can't get onto Kim's link, please drop us an email on info@playsense.org and we can assist you further.
Okay, excellent. All right, and Larita's actually got another great question. She said, thanks for a great session. Really interested. After being in a place-sense school, is it better to homeschool instead of sending children to large classes? So, I think, and this is such an interesting thing, because homeschooling is becoming more and more topical, and more parents are making choices. And I think homeschooling is a fabulous option as long as you've got the socialization aspect coming alongside it, which is really what it's all about. So if you can educate your child by homeschooling them and have afternoon activities or even morning activities with other homeschoolers, I think homeschooling can be absolutely fabulous. Really, either of them can be good scenarios. So even having a normal school would also be a good solution, but just watching the quality of education. And then, of course, we do have a webinar coming up next week, which is actually focused on how to homeschool your child. So if any of you are interested in homeschooling rather than putting them into play sense, or if you believe that you are going to rather do a little bit of homeschooling and then only put them into bigger schools maybe next year once the threat of the pandemic has moved on, we've got you covered. So we've actually got a webinar next week, which is all about having you covered to execute homeschooling as well. So either way, good options. I see other people are still battling with Kim's link.
There's a new link there, Meg.
Okay, all right, there's a new link. All right, so her other link wasn't working. Sorry about that, everybody who was waiting for Durban and for KwaZulu-Natal and Port Elizabeth. Right, so I think, does that bring us to the end of it?
On our attendees, I see that there are still some parents on. Other than that, it looks like a lot of our internal team, as well as some teachers. Right. But if there are any other parents,
any other questions? Any other questions?
Marilyn, Cassandra.
All right.
Okay.
I'm going to hop off, Melissa. So thank you all for joining me. Melissa, are you also going to hop off, or are you going to wait a little longer?
I'm more than happy to wait if anyone's got more questions, okay. But I don't know if we do. I think that's everybody.
The end of it. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us, and I really do hope that you join PlaySense. I do think that you'll find it's the best decision that you've made as a parent, because that's the type of thing that our wonderful teachers tell us, and our parents tell us as well. So, thank you so much. Good night, everybody.